Thank you very much, Mark. It's really a treat to be back here at ASIL. I was thinking this morning, anticipating being here, that Halloween used to be one of my favorite days at Tiller House because you may not know, but all the college students in greater Washington area trick or treat up and down Embassy Row here, and the embassies give out candy, and it would be a lot of fun. I think the rain may dampen the spirit, but we may have some ghosts and goblins and witches traipsing through today. It is a real pleasure to collaborate with our friends at ASIL, and I'm really grateful to Mark for hosting, to Wes and the rest of the team for welcoming us here today. You may not know that they are on the eve of their mid-year meeting, which is a very busy time, and so it's particularly remarkable that they're being so hospitable to us. But it's an important topic that brings us here, and I'm really grateful to Hurst Hannum for his important new book, shedding some light on where we are in the human rights field today, and look forward to a really stimulating discussion. We at WJP, as Mark mentioned, have a mission to generate knowledge, awareness, and action to advance the rule of law. We do that in the first instance by gathering data about the state of the rule of law around the world, and maybe it won't be a surprise, but it is startling what the data show, that the rule of law is not trending in the right direction around the world, and particularly with respect to fundamental rights. So we have a rule of law index, and there I think are copies of this publication around, which are highlights from our 2019 index. And it highlights a pretty startling finding. We have 8 factors that we measure on the rule of law, and they include factor 4 on fundamental rights. And it is, over the last 4 years, the most steeply declining of our factors. 70% of the countries, 127 countries in which we do polling, have seen a decline, a statistically significant decline in protection of fundamental rights over the last 4 years. So that's a wake-up call to us. Some have characterized it as a crisis, others a crossroads, and we are all grappling with what it means and what we should do about it. And there are, I think you will hear on the panel today, some very different perspectives on that. And in good ASIL fashion, we'll shed some light on that and invite your thoughts and exchange as well. We'll begin today, after I introduce the speakers, with a presentation from Professor Hannum about his new book, Rescuing Human Rights, and then some commentary from Ambassador Mendelsohn and Mark Bromley, and then some back and forth among them, I'm sure, and we'll open it up to all of you. But let me begin by introducing our distinguished panelists. So we have Professor Hurst Hannum, the author of this new book, and also Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He began his career with the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, working as co-counsel to bring cases of ill treatment by British security forces during the Troubles to the European Commission for Human Rights. And he has since authored numerous books and articles on human rights and been active as counsel and a thought leader in this field for decades. To his right, we have Ambassador Sarah Mendelsohn, who is the Distinguished Service Professor of Public Policy and head of Heinz College in Washington, D.C. She also has a long and distinguished career intersecting human rights and policy. She was a scholar and practitioner working with the National Democratic Institute in Moscow, on the faculty of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, a common thread there, and inaugural director of the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. After serving as Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID, Sarah was confirmed as U.S. Representative to the Economic and Social Council at the United Nations, position she served in the Obama administration until she left on January 20th, 2017. At noon. And to Ambassador Mendelsohn's right, we have Mark Bromley, who's the chair of the Council for Global Equality, a leading organization working to advance LGBT rights around the world. And Mark is a very forceful and effective advocate for that cause. He launched the council 10 years ago to encourage clearer and stronger American voice on international LGBT rights. And as I say, that organization is a very effective advocate in that space. Among other things, he provided the first ever testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the state of LGBT rights around the world, and will share that perspective with us on the panel today. So with that introduction, I'll turn the floor over to Professor Hannum to tell us how we are going to rescue human rights.
Well, thank you very much, Betsy, and let me begin by thanking both the Society and the World Justice Program for being willing to host this and to give us a free lunch. Since I've been teaching for a long time, I realize that the only way that you know you're going to get students is to provide food for them. And so I see that Washington has changed not very much. It's a delight to be back. As Mark mentioned, I've been involved with the Society in various capacities for many, many years. And not only Mark, but also Larry Garber, who's in the audience, are people that I met about 30 years ago in Washington, D.C. And to have Northern Ireland mentioned as well means that I'm much older than I look. At least I like to think that I look better, younger than I am. Let me start off with giving you a couple of assumptions that I've made in the book. Because there's been so much criticism about human rights, the end times, the last utopia, et cetera, it's important to begin by saying that I really do want to rescue human rights. I think along with decolonization, the notion that everyone in the world has rights simply because they're human, which is, for me, the foundation of human rights, was one of the most important developments since 1945 in international law. Second assumption is that the survival of human rights is not guaranteed. And that is not only because of the current political environment in which we find ourselves in the world, but also, I think, because some of the directions that human rights have taken, which I will be critical of, not in most cases, and I do want to underline this because I think that the substance that is being promoted under the rubric of human rights is not worth promoting. In some cases, I think it's actually more important than human rights. But because that attaching human rights to everything good in the world is probably not the way that we're going to rescue them. Final assumption, and this is not just because we're at the ASIL, is that human rights are best understood as law. And I say that not because there's anything magical about law. Law changes. Human rights were not handed down on golden tablets, so I'm not looking back to the good old days when human rights were nice and constrained. But if we want to know what human rights are, as opposed to what we think they should be, law is the only place we can look. That's where human rights are defined. And philosophers and ethicists in political science may define them some other way. But we can at least find out how far we've come. Second reason that law is important is because, to me, implementing human rights is persuading governments to change their policies. Every government in the world has agreed to have their conduct in human rights reviewed by their peers in the UN based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the two international covenants. In addition, most of them have ratified human rights treaties. And so one of the easiest ways of avoiding complaints that human rights are neo-colonial somehow is to point to the law. We're not asking you to do anything that you haven't already agreed to. Hypocrisy remains one of the great strengths of human rights advocacy. I just want to, because we do have a fairly short amount of time, highlight three of the sort of larger categories of problems that I think have arisen with human rights, not just in the past few years, but gradually since the 1990s, really, since history did not end despite all of the acclamations to the contrary. The first and most common criticism that I think people make about human rights concerns their proliferation or their exaggeration. Human rights have gone far beyond rights that apply in not exactly, but sort of the same way to 8 billion people around the world, to a collection of much more specific subcategories of rights, of either substance the right to torture, or identifying particular groups that are marginalized or discriminated against or simply forgotten. And more popularly, human rights have come to mean anything. The a Chinese government official in 2008 claimed publicly that China had a human right to host the 2008 Olympics. One of the Ecuadorian government officials in London who was hosting Julian Assange said that he had a human right to sunbathe and shouldn't be spied on. A very well-known child psychologist, whose name I forget, wrote a long book about how important it is for children to be loved. Well, that's not a surprising conclusion, but his conclusion that therefore children have a human right to be loved was a bit surprising. Just a couple of weeks ago in The Guardian, an op-ed said that there was a right to eat food on the metro. Now, I confess that that last one was said somewhat in jest, but it's an example of how the discourse of human rights has gone beyond what really are fundamental rights for real people in the real world to include anything that's good. I'll just offer as one example the current push to develop or create a human right to a sustainable or healthy environment. Human rights has already dealt with environmental issues through existing rights. There is a human right to health in the Economic, Social, and Cultural Covenant, the human right to life in the Civil and Political Covenant, and human rights bodies have consistently included as violations things that government didn't prevent, like environmental damage or rubbish dumps that exploded, things like that. There has been, for the last 5 years, I think, an intergovernmental project in the UN to draft a new treaty on human rights in business. And they've had a couple drafts so far, still very contentious, and their most recent draft, I take that all back. I'm confusing the environment with business. That's what happens when you give this talk too often. But my question about the environment in particular is what calling it a human right, a separate human right, will add. I mean, John Knox, the first special rapporteur, was terrific in identifying the limits of human rights as well as their potential, and that's something that a notion that I will probably conclude with. But particularly today, if only as a tactical measure, attaching human rights and proclaiming a human right to a healthy environment is hardly likely to get the Chinese and the Russians and the Brazilians on our side. And human rights won't tell us how to fix the problem. There is such an extraordinary complexity of economic, social, political, and other concerns that since we already have a human rights foothold that's very important into the issue, I just don't understand why so much energy is being expended in making a symbolic declaration that there's something about the human rights and the environment that is worth recognizing, which of course leaves out much of what we want to do to save the environment. John Knox used to end a number of his presentations with a PowerPoint of a polar bear on a lonely small ice floe as a way of demonstrating to the audience what a human right to the environment would not include. It doesn't include just preserving things because they're beautiful. And so human rights both won't add much to the environment and also will in fact detract from what we need to demand in order to fix the climate crisis that we're in. A second problem that I think is relatively endemic is that we've discovered in doing human rights work that it's very difficult to change government behavior, and it's a very slow process. And we know there are other actors out there who are problems in the world. And to pick another issue that will no doubt raise a few hackles among you, sometimes we go for what we think are lower hanging fruit. And in this case, I'm thinking of business. Business hurts people, there's no doubt. Not just transnational corporations, but domestic corporations as well. And business should be held accountable. We started off talking about corporate social responsibility years ago. Now suddenly we've connected business and human rights, and we have a set of guidelines. In fact, we have over 200 guidelines that have been adopted around the world including, I think it was by the Swiss or the Austrians, a set of guidelines as to how to draft guidelines on business and human rights. And I'm not making this up. Businesses are still under the control of at least two states, the states in which they're doing business and in many cases the state in which they're incorporated. But the problem with what is developed in the UN is that the guidelines for business are purely voluntary. They give almost no specificity. They say that businesses are responsible for all human rights, for respecting all human rights. And they make what's a rather silly distinction that will be missed by everyone except lawyers between the non-legal ethical responsibility of business and the legal obligations of government. And this, I think, is one of the real flaws with connecting these two issues. Human rights aren't just good ideas. They're legal obligations that have been undertaken by every single government in the world, one way or the other. And to confuse those with guidelines and codes of conduct and principles, I think, does a disservice to the term human rights and doesn't get us any farther in trying to control, regulate, and hold accountable businesses. The new treaty that I mistakenly remembered mentioned a couple of minutes ago, this being produced, is in its second draft now, and it doesn't impose a single obligation directly on business. All it does is to set out what governments should do to regulate business, all of which are already in the jurisdiction and within the control of governments. So rather than wasting time in Geneva, it would make a lot more sense to get some good corporate lawyers who happen to be sympathetic to human rights to start changing how governments regulate their companies and how they hold them accountable. Another little problem with marginalizing government is that we do oversell what civil society can accomplish. Civil society is incredibly important. It's both a symptom of a healthy rights-respecting society, and it's also necessary for it to develop. But pretending that giving money to human rights NGOs, hoping that they will influence governments or create a movement in favor of human rights, is, number one, giving money to often incredibly well-meaning people who are often working in dire circumstances and putting themselves at risk. But it's also giving money to people who aren't accountable to anyone except their donors and maybe a small board that oversees their activities. And they just can't do 90% of what need to be done if we want to ensure human rights. They can help with education, they can help with voter registration drives, I suppose, but they don't hold trials, they don't hold elections. They're not primarily responsible for health care. And so, without wishing to denigrate at all the very important services that civil society can bring, it's not going to do much for human rights. It's going after the easier fruit. The third and final issue I want to bring up is the fact that the basis of human rights is their universality. It's the universal Declaration of Human Rights. But increasingly, and again, especially since the end of the Cold War, universality is becoming closer and closer to what the developing world has always accused us of being, and that is neo-colonialists who are trying to make the rest of the world under the guise of promoting human rights. Universality is not the same thing as uniformity. There are human rights principles. Human rights documents themselves give a great deal of flexibility to governments to both interpret and balance human rights against one of the others. Very few human rights are absolute. And the expectation of any drafter of any human rights treaty was not that the goal was to make every country in the world look like Sweden. I always use Sweden in my classes as the perfect country, and of course it has its problems, but let's pretend it is the perfect country. We still don't want every country to look like Sweden. We don't want to destroy every culture and remake it in the mode of the most progressive Western European countries. That presents some problems. But in this country, we do just fine with that. We have states that have all sorts of legal rights that can't be affected, and legal powers that can't be affected by the federal government. We have a Supreme Court that isn't able to tell us what obscenity is. We left that to community standards. Well, if that's what we do inside the United States, and granted it's a big country, but at the very least we need to do that with respect to the 195 or so countries in the world, with very different cultures, levels of development, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to see human rights not as best practices to which we have to coerce people to accept, but rather as a very minimal standard for the way governments should work. Human rights are absolutely essential to create a context in which difficult social, economic, political questions can be examined and ultimately decided upon. But they were never intended to tell us exactly what governments and societies should look like. In short, human rights are not a panacea for all the world's problems. And by linking human rights to too many of these problems, we do a disservice to human rights because they're incapable in and of themselves of dealing with these problems or finding solutions. And we also, I think, limit what we should be doing to fix some of these problems, like the accountability of business, like the climate crisis. When I say that we need to take human rights seriously, remember their universality, remember that they require a degree of consensus, ultimately at least. This isn't, as I said, going back. It's also not, as would be popular in the United States, and it's popular probably with our new Commission on Unalienable Rights that Secretary Pompeo has put together. It doesn't mean pretending that there's some hierarchy that starts with freedom of religion. It doesn't mean, as the U.S. is the only country to pretend, that human rights only mean civil and political rights that reflect the U.S. Constitution. But what it does mean is that the full gamut of fundamental rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural, are where we start. And we should try to keep in mind what human rights can achieve and not undermine them by connecting them to issues that may even be more important, like the climate crisis. But we will do neither human rights nor something like the environment any good by doing that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Much to chew on there, and I'm not going to do anything other than turn to Sarah and let her take a big bite.
Well, happy Halloween, and happy day after the Nationals won the World Series.
Here, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that.
Let me start where we agree. We agree that it's really terrific that ails and the World Justice Project convened this great gathering. It's a pleasure to be with you. First, we overlapped at the Fletcher School in what was a very, very different political era. I essentially left the week before 9/11, but I started there in January 1999. So it was a different time. And we can agree that there is absolutely a crisis. We are living through and have witnessed an epidemic of closing space around human rights NGOs, civil society organizations in general. Universities have been affected, humanitarian organizations. Dozens of countries, hundreds of laws have been passed, making it difficult for these organizations to survive. Some of you who are in the room have personal experience with this, so we agree there's a crisis. And there's also, of course, a cottage industry of books that are on it. Where we disagree, I think, is what's causing the crisis, and I want to focus on that. I don't see it as much as rescuing human rights as actually reframing or refreshing how we talk and how we think about human rights. And I come to this in part because I ask the question, is this crisis because actually of this burgeoning effort to expand human rights? Is it happening because there's actually been, for example, an effort to build human rights compliance into better business practices? I don't think that it's because I have a political science background and not a legal background that I'm going to make the argument that I'm going to make, although I realize it's a little odd to be making it in the presence of so many lawyers and legal scholars. But I'm actually arguing from a practitioner's perspective based on the work that some of us did at USAID and then at USUN. I'm actually arguing that the crisis is in part a reflection of an over-reliance on legal frameworks that are viewed by populations around the world as very niche, elitist, and not engaging in the most pressing issues of their time. It is extremely unfortunate that when a lot of these human rights organizations come under pressure, populations essentially shrug. They're not seen as actually engaging in the issues that they most care about. I want to make one point about an example of one area where the predominant approach to combating, for example, human trafficking has been from a legal perspective. It's been a focus on prosecution. Whether you take the number 46 million, 20 million, or 10 million people that are trafficked around the world, we do know the number of prosecutions, and that number hovers between 17,000 and 20,000 a year globally. And the argument I'm making is that the predominant approach to combating human trafficking through prosecution is important, but there are other ways to do this, including greater consciousness by consumers about supply chains. And this brings me to good news, which is that the way in which I think we can refresh and reframe human rights is actually with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm not making an argument about the UN. I'm making an argument about an agenda that was informed by millions of people around the world, particularly young people, who weighed in on what they thought were the most pressing issues. It is a paradigm shift in how we think about development. Development happens here as well as there, but it's also a paradigm shift in how we think about sustainability. This is not just about climate, although it includes climate, but it's about peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. That's why we have groups like the ICTJ holding a meeting on Goal 16 in The Hague last week. Why we have a talk at the Oxford School of Law with the Danish Institute of Human Rights talking about how the UN human rights mechanisms have been engaging the SDGs. So this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to refresh how we're thinking about human rights and human rights happening here as well as there, to engage on reducing inequality, to take on corruption, to broadening constituencies, especially among the youth. There are very specific ways in which the 16+ agenda, this peaceful, just, inclusive society, could emerge. There's a growing movement around having all forms of violence by 2030. There's work that I think Betsy and your organization are involved in radically increasing access to justice by 2030. There's absolutely efforts at targeting corruption, including laws on beneficial ownership and cutting off dictators' dollars and Putin's pounds that flow through our cities. And there is an alliance around combating human trafficking that goes beyond the legal frameworks. Let me close with 3 points. I think the argument that Hurst is advancing is actually one that is trying to reverse time. The power of NGOs has grown immensely, you're right. When I was teaching at Fletcher, I taught a course on NGOs in the international system. And I think it was one of the only courses looking at NGOs and advocacy organizations, 99, 2000, 2001, what is now very through commonplace. But to think that governments are the only ones that should have this power, I think is an argument that is very favorable to the Russian Federation and China. It is the argument that I heard when I was serving on the NGO committee at the UN to try and get NGOs accredited, that really the UN is for member states only. The idea, for example, that domestic criminal justice systems are the rightful place and only place to root out corruption flies in the face of an organic movement around open government and open government systems that we see with the Open Government Partnership, 70+ countries and civil society organizations. It flies in the face of frankly, the Euromaidan dignity revolution in Ukraine. And then finally, the idea that binding legal obligations on governments are superior to what are admittedly voluntary commitments around the Sustainable Development Goals. You don't have to look at Russia to see that that's not the case, where frankly government and companies are one, they're not separate. We just need to look to the decade after the 9/11 attack and how the US dealt with torture. The fact that at one point we put torture in the cat in the win category, and then it can be so easily undone, I think really suggests that even if we have a legal obligation, it doesn't necessarily mean it's hard and fast. And without having the advocacy of organizations, NGOs, it's not clear to me that we wouldn't still be engaging in torture. So thank you.
Okay. Okay, an interesting contrast. We're going to turn then to one of those powerful civil society organizations and hear from Mark.
Thank you, and go Nats. I got to give that shout out as well. So yeah, I want to ground a few comments in sort of my background as an NGO advocate, and particularly an NGO advocate fighting for human rights protections and engagement here in the trenches in Washington, D.C. at this unique moment in our political history. And I'd like to push back gently on two kind of broad notions that I think Professor Hannum raised. First is that there is in fact a crisis in human rights that needs rescuing, right? I'd like to push back a little bit on that, or at least how we define the problem. But I'd also like to push back a little bit on the fact that if there is a problem, or I would certainly admit that there's a strain on the system, that strain comes from a confusion in what are human rights and or a proliferation of rights. And I think that's really kind of the same argument in many ways. So I want to push back on that a little bit as well. I'll take the second first, this idea that there's a confusion in human rights. My organization and a number of other human rights organizations here in Washington have been very concerned with Secretary Pompeo's new Commission on Unalienable Rights that Professor Hannum mentioned. And the first meeting last week did not do much to allay our concerns. But in introducing that commission last week, Secretary Pompeo essentially said that there's great confusion out there in human rights. People can't tell what's a human right, what is a political goal, and what is a personal preference. And so we really need to get back to basics. And in his mind, getting back to basics means reimagining human rights based on our country's founding documents, particularly unalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence, the philosophies of natural law theory, and sort of the traditions of the Puritans who grounded much of our political thinking, and the Bill of Rights. And in fact, the first meeting of the commission last week was 7 hours specifically on the definition of unalienable rights. It was I would say non-Geneva compliant in some ways. But you know, in some ways, I think Professor Hannum, I don't think he is at all in support of this commission, is positing that there is that confusion out there about what are human rights and what are preferences, what are just good objectives, right? And sure, I'm willing to admit that there's some laziness about how we use the term human rights, about some of the rhetoric. But when I look at sort of where we are in terms of the modern human rights project, as people like to talk about it, I see a real attempt to take a lot of the fundamental rights that we see in the UDHR and the core human rights treaties and apply them in new ways with new sensitivities to minority groups that we've ignored in the past, to difficult situations, whether they be in armed conflict or in environments where the environment is literally in crisis. We're trying to apply those fundamental norms to new situations or groups that have been excluded or marginalized in the past. Marianne Glendon, who's the chair of the Commission on Unalienable Rights, she often writes about there being 30 core obligations in the UDHR. And I think Professor Hannum said that there's maybe a couple hundred in his book. He talks about, I think, a couple hundred in the core international human rights treaties. I haven't counted them, but I would posit that there are some core rights to life, to expression, to religion, that the freedom against torture, that are cross-cutting and clearly defined in the legal sense that Professor Hannam has been talking about. And then there's this attempt, in many cases, to take those rights and apply them to groups who have traditionally been excluded or have a difficult time claiming those rights, or apply them in situations where those rights are under pressure or are strained. And those exercises, particularly at the UN, inevitably generate these guiding principles that Professor Hannam has talked about. And I don't see those guiding principles as necessarily problematic. I agree there are a lot of them, and maybe we don't need a principles of principles document. But I do think many of those exercises are sincere attempts to really look at human rights through the lens of marginalized and disadvantaged communities. Now, Professor Hannam writes a lot about the Ruggie principles that attempt to apply human rights principles and norms in the context of business. I'm more familiar working on global LGBTI issues and the ways in which lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and increasingly intersex individuals are seeking to claim their rights. And in that context, the guiding principles are called the Yogyakarta principles, and they were developed by leading UN and other human rights experts. And they attempt to take these fundamental rights to expression, the right to association, and apply them to LGBTI individuals and groups, right? And I do think we occasionally confuse that exercise, right? Sometimes we talk about LGBTI rights, and I think that is a mistake. There are no LGBTI rights. There are human rights that LGBTI individuals seek to claim. And I think we do have to be precise in how we talk about that, and I agree with Professor Hannam. And in fact, Secretary Clinton's famous speech at the UN before the UN in Geneva in 2011, where she stood up and said that gay rights are human rights are gay rights. And that was obviously a riff on her very famous speech in Beijing to say that women's rights are human rights. What she meant there was that they literally are the same thing. It's not a book of gay rights that we're taking off the shelf and adding to the collection of human rights books. It's that they are one and the same. There's no difference. It's an equal sign that goes between gay rights and human rights. And therefore, in a sense, there are no gay rights, there are only human rights, and we look at the application. So I agree the UN system is messy and there's a proliferation of these guidelines, but I want to push back and just challenge that a lot of that is sincere work to apply the core legal principles to groups that have often been denied those rights or have had no voice in the past at the UN or in other spaces. I think this is also true in a recent and very controversial decision by Amnesty International that I just want to flag, but I think is worth thinking about, where they recently decided that they want to prioritize the abolition of laws against sex work as a human rights priority, right? And it's not because they're saying that sex workers have a fundamental right to engage in sex work. It's not based on the right to work. It's based on the fact that there's no way to protect sex workers from violence, from exploitation, from other forms of human rights abuse without eliminating the law in the first place. So again, I think there's been a lot of confusion about, is there a right to sex work? And I think that gets us to the wrong place. No, they've decided there's no other way to protect sex workers except to abolish laws that criminalize sex work. So again, I think we just have to be careful about how we're characterizing this proliferation of rights. Second, just again, gently, I'd like to push back on this idea that there's a crisis. When I look at the UN human rights system, yes, Venezuela was just elected to the Human Rights Council, and Saudi Arabia is on the council, and it's messy, and we reformed the Commission on Human Rights into the Human Rights Council, and that was supposed to improve the system, and it really hasn't to the extent we had hoped. It's a messy system. It's a messy, complicated world. But I don't think we're in more of a crisis than we have been at various points, certainly going back to the Cold War. And I think it's dangerous to use that term crisis because I think it is being exploited by individuals like Secretary Pompeo, who I think want to use this crisis or the idea of a crisis to assert a very new understanding of human rights that is based very much on a hierarchy of rights with unalienable rights at the pinnacle. And by unalienable rights, he clearly means freedom of religion. And in fact, his signature political effort at the State Department has been to center our human rights policy and programming and funding around religious freedom. He took the Office of Religious Freedom out of the Human Rights Bureau of the State Department, where it played an integrated role in thinking about human rights, and elevated it, both literally and figuratively, to the 7th floor to be a satellite office to his own office, and it was elevated bureaucratically in the State Department. So, and he's right now at the UN actively promoting a new coalition on religious freedom that will seek to promote and prioritize religious freedom globally. And I think this is dangerous. I think it's dangerous for the human rights system that we created 70 years ago and that may be strained, but I don't think is in crisis. I think it's dangerous for religious freedom in the first place because essentially the Secretary of State is handing a tool to theocratic governments that oppress their own religious minorities. The greatest danger to religious freedom is from religious majorities around the world, right? So Secretary Pompeo is handing them a new talking point and some political leverage. And I really think ultimately this is a crisis in US political leadership and the political leadership of many of our traditional allies. And so I think we need to be careful not to talk about a crisis in the Human Rights Project, but to talk about a crisis in leadership in support of that project 70 years on.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Mark. Hurst, I'm going to turn back to you and invite maybe first an exchange between Hurst and Sarah, specifically on the issue of the SDGs. And Hurst, I'd like you to comment on Sarah's observation that that's where there's a lot of action right now. And wouldn't it just be strategic, instrumental to position the human rights movement to take advantage of all that activity and action to advance the cause? And or do you have some guardrails to put on any such effort?
Well, first, let me tell you what I agreed with. And there was more than just that we are both thanking the Society and the World Justice Program. I think the SDGs are great. I mean, they deal with development, they deal with the environment, they deal with inequality. The people who are trying to implement them know what they're talking about. A lot of them are not lawyers. They're actually experts in the environment or in development. And so, I mean, my question is, what is human rights going to add to them? Unless it's a purely Machiavellian way of saying, here's something hot, we need to be part of it. This is trending now, so let's attach human rights to it. I mean, I think that the perspective you're reflecting, and you're not responsible for this because you didn't say it, came out in an issue of Human Rights Quarterly earlier this year. Someone named Andrew Fagan, who wrote about the gentrification of human rights, and as being a problem. The gentrification, I mean, it's an odd word, but it restricts the ability of human rights to engage robustly with rising deprivation, inequality, and marginalization within affluent, liberal, democratic societies. And then he goes on to talk about how it's necessary, if human rights is to genuinely stake a claim to a deserved status of being a key political idiom for social justice in these times of rapidly increasing deprivation, inequality, and marginalization, it needs to change. I don't think that's what human rights are. I mean, there are serious questions about social marginalization, economic deprivation, what the proper degree of equality is within societies, not only in economic terms, but in other terms. Human rights are supposed to apply to all societies, to all people, no matter what their level of development. They're supposed to be something that can at least conceivably be considered to be universal. Not looking exactly the same in every place, but at least universal. What's the matter with politics and economics and ethics and social change, which has nothing to do with law? I don't identify human rights as law because I want law to take over. I want law to step into the background. It's much less important for the SDGs achievement than are these other ways of getting political change. I agree with you that governments aren't enough and that civil society is incredibly important, but I disagree violently with the notion that governments aren't essential and that you can ignore them because they're the only ones who are going to resolve the climate crisis. They're the only ones. It's not going to be done by private companies. It's going to have to be transnational. And if human rights are a little part of it, it's fine, but let's not just back away from the hard cases and align ourselves with those with whom we already agree. And I think that sometimes we do make the mistake, and well, in Washington I'm safe in saying this anyway, because of the reception that President Trump got at the World Series. But I would doubt if there are more than 3 people in this room who would identify themselves as conservatives. I won't ask for a show of hands. If all of you think that you're doing human rights work and you're all liberal, that's a problem. Human rights are not just for liberal democracies. A lot of human rights can be protected in much less desirable forms of government. And it's not enough to find the best and to strive for it, because that's not what human rights is going to help you do. And so I don't want to take away from, human trafficking is a criminal justice issue. It's not about law and more treaties. It's about poverty. It's about all sorts of changes that need to be made so human trafficking will not either be economically or socially acceptable in countries. I don't know what that has to do with human rights. The practice of female genital mutilation in Africa, everyone agrees, is not going to be resolved by making it criminal, even though it has been made criminal in most places. It's going to be diminished by changes within communities, helped by outsiders and NGOs. It's going to be changed by social and moral and ethical demands changing in communities about having new rituals, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to be changed by human rights law, although that may be where the idea that it's bad came from. Should I give you a chance to answer that, and then I'll just have a couple
Yeah,
things
I want to ask Sarah, what does law give you in the SDG context? Do you need law? Or maybe actually you and Hurst are really
We may disagree
much
less
more
than we think.
in agreement.
Look, I'm not saying that law is irrelevant. I'm saying that it doesn't get us completely where we want to go. It's been very effective. Again, let's take the human trafficking case, although I don't understand how you can argue extreme forms of human trafficking include slavery. Being enslaved is a human rights violation. The global movement since 2000, of which the United States leadership has been important, has resulted in, happily, dozens and dozens of laws criminalizing human trafficking in a shared protocol that has been signed on by 70 countries at this point. That's all important, but it hasn't eliminated the problem. It helps in countries that care about their reputation, but the problems are still pervasive. So what is exciting to me about, and I'm not saying also that government has no role, I'm actually, where we're seeing a lot of action is at local levels in cities, which is extremely exciting, and there's the possibility of, for our political system, a revitalization where citizens are engaging their ecosystems within cities where young people are going to have a voice, for example, on the right to life, specifically on gun safety. I mean, there is so much that is vital and coming up and bubbling that is not it's not to say government isn't important, it's to say that there's a way in which citizen voice has a possibility of being heard in all the issues that are plaguing us right now. So I feel like I feel like it's a pinched understanding or a narrow understanding of human rights that you're trying to make. That's the argument you're making. But I think it's taking us back in time and not going to get us through what is, we agree, a very difficult time. I'm trying to have a kind of long game approach and seeing that there are a number of possibilities where you could have real movement on issues, including access to justice, including corruption, including inequality, including reducing various forms of violence, and that ultimately we'd be in a much different world in terms of human rights in 2030 if those things were achieved.
So Hurst, what Sarah may be suggesting is that imagine if you eliminate human trafficking, but there's no human rights treaty involved or no UN human rights mechanism involved. None of the things, the trappings,
That
what
would
we
be
usually
wonderful.
think. But would that be human rights progress?
Oh, well, of course it would.
Right.
I mean,
So
but it would also be, human rights doesn't cover all of the harms or all of the goods that people want or from which they suffer. Human rights can provide you talked about the closing space. Human rights can help you open that space. What it won't do in many cases is tell you what the result of opening that space is going to be. I mean, most of the things that you described are crimes. There have been laws against murder since the beginning of time. We still have murders. We have school shootings. I don't know what saying, oh, that's a violation of my human right to life is going to do. It's a crime. Talk about criminal justice. Talk to the people who can actually stop trafficking. Talk about poverty and how families can sell their children. And as I say, those are probably more important than human rights. I just don't understand. I confess I'm being very protective of something I've worked on for 40 years now. But I do know its limitations. And it can get you in the door. That's what's important about it. And there's certainly nothing wrong. Isn't it enough just to say enslaving mostly women and selling them for sex or for domestic helpers is a terrible thing that violates every moral and religious principle that we can think of. And then you have to add, because it's going to help, oh, and it's also a human rights violation? That's my problem. We're not disagreeing about the goals, but I do think that as human rights are attached to more and more things that are more and more complicated and that are not going to be achieved. You mentioned halting violence in the next 15 years. Well, good luck with that. I'd rather not have anybody say, human rights is going to halt violence in the next 15 years. Go ahead.
Cut it in half.
Cut it in half. Okay, even cut it in half. It's a wonderful claim for the SDGs to make, and I hope they do. I don't want human rights to be accused of doing that, because they just can't. All they can do is create the context. They can highlight some things on issues particularly of discrimination and equality. I think that's where human rights have a real substantive impact as well, which would lead me to Mark.
Great, let's circle back and talk about, and in particular, how do you avoid the risks of hierarchy in your argument? We talk whether it's hierarchy or core, there's a differentiation that seems to be being made that I'd be interested in your responding to.
Well, it's important to remember the source. The differentiation is being made by Mike Pompeo. And so just to leave no doubt, I agree with everything you said about the commission, all of its nefarious motives. And I think we give it far too much credit by taking it seriously. I think the best thing to do is ignore it. It's going to come up with a tract that prefers religious freedom over all other freedoms in this country that will be supported by the base of the president and that no one else will accept and that deserves to be attacked on that basis. Not to say, oh, criticizing human rights and saying we might be a little confused is an excuse for Mike Pompeo. That's a criticism I won't accept. I do very much take your point on the difference between applying human rights to everyone, because after all, that's what it's supposed to do. That's the way it's supposed to work. A A Norwegian law professor who was involved in human rights for many, many years used to say that all human rights are about protecting the rights of minorities. Problem is, because majorities take care of themselves, and the minorities don't generally do the discriminating until they get in power, and then often they do. But that's a minor problem. But the minorities that the international law deals with are ethnic, religious, linguistics. They're not the poor. They're not sex minorities, if I can use the broadest term I can think of. They're not the stupid. They're not the uneducated. And there are lots of reasons why people are discriminated against. One of the most difficult chapters I wrote in the book was one unambitiously called Women, Sex, and Gender. And it was intended really as more of a description of how human rights have dealt with those three related but different categories. Discrimination against women is easy. That's in the UN Charter of all things. Now, it's easy in the sense that it was clearly illegal and we had to then do something about it, or unacceptable. Very early on in the history of human rights bodies like the European Commission on Human Rights and others, human rights advocates and institutions interpreted no discrimination based on sex as including no discrimination based on sexual preference or orientation or on having transitioned from one sex to another. So human rights is very progressive on that. The European Court even recently went a bit further. It had said way back in the 1980s that transsexuals have the rights to have their identity cards protected or changed. But they said you couldn't change your birth certificate. Well, 5 years ago, they finally decided that they could change your birth certificate. And that's only Europe, but it's a step forward. Gender, on the other hand, is something that no one understands. And for most of my adult life, gender has been a socially constructed idea of what the respective roles were for men and women. And because it could be socially constructed, it could be socially deconstructed. In the last 10 years or so, it's acquired an entirely different connotation or understanding, in that it's both a fluid but an essential identity marker for people. Facebook, I think, recognizes 70 different descriptions for gender. I just have to read this to you. There's the University of California, Davis, very legitimate institution. There's a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual resource center, which has on its an online glossary to help people understand these things. And the introduction of the glossary says, quote, "These terms, quote, are always evolving and changing and often mean different things to different people. They are a starting point for discussion and understanding." That sounds perfectly reasonable. It's not something that global human rights law can ever deal with if we can't understand what the subject matter is. What it can do, and I'm glad that, I think you mentioned it implicitly at least, is say that however you identify yourself, you can't be attacked physically for it. You can't be discriminated against, at least in the public sphere, in jobs and government. You can't go much farther and say, and you have to be socially accepted. You have to be, your parents, I'm sorry, but we can blame our parents for everything. It's not a violation of human rights for your parents to tell you that if you, I hate to use the term marry, but let's use the term because we understand it, marry someone of a different faith, of a different race, of an inappropriate gender, that we're never going to speak to you again. It's an immoral approach to take, but it doesn't violate human rights. And so there should be, and I think it's happening incredibly with LGBT rights particularly, first, not an assertion so much that it's human rights, but just that this is something good, something positive, something not to be afraid of, and to be careful, as I think the Joe Yurkarta principles do in some places, to unnecessarily exaggerate what human rights already do provide. They do provide a lot, and I absolutely support your approach of applying them. And it's maybe just more of an advocate versus a professor's view right now as to how far one goes. I'm glad you mentioned the Amnesty discussion of sex work, because there's never going to be a universal human rights norm on sex work. There shouldn't be. You look at the implications, it'll be different in every country. And so I think we probably agree less than it might have first appeared blush. Or
Okay.
first appear at first blush.
We can keep going, but I bet others want to jump in, so let me open it up to the audience. So Larry.
So, first of all, congratulations. Good, really interesting panel, and nice differences amongst you, so both of us.
Really?
But first, I want to get back to some of the things that you're proposing, and just to make sure I understand where you're going. So, for you, what do you think are the purpose of human rights? Is it, and why are you concerned about sort of this expansion and lack of, or proliferation of concepts that fall under it? Is it a political issue that, so you get confused when you go to these political forums that are called human rights, and basically anyone who wants to say something, can feel like she or he can say something there? Or is it because you really believe that human rights in a narrowly prescribed form has legal consequences that you want to see secured? And if that's the case, how do you think that works? I mean, what is the difference between, in your mind, the human right and the criminal law? I mean, so Sarah's case of trafficking, call it, trafficking a criminal thing, or call it something that, I feel is a violation of human rights. What is the difference from where you're sitting, whether it's one or the other? What is the advantage of having it more narrowly defined?
Right. Well, narrow, I think, is a misstatement. If you only want to look at the two covenants, they're not narrow.
Right.
And so it's not true that human rights is narrow and we have to fit all this new stuff into it, because much of it is there through application or interpretation. I think the genius of human rights, and why I think it was one of the most revolutionary things to have happened in law, but I think in politics and philosophy as well since 1945, is this notion that we all have some rights that have been, at least to that initial stage, there was agreement on the part of governments who undertook an obligation to change their laws, some did, some didn't, to reflect this agreement on things that were absolutely unheard of in most countries at the time. Now, I'm not aware that we've managed to implement all of those things, or even most of those things, or even a significant minority of those things through domestic legislation yet. I'd sort of like to see us finish something and say we finally did abolish torture. We're not going to do that because that's one of the human rights norms that might change. Not all change is going to be in the positive direction. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a panel at the ASIL one of these days on the emerging customary international law that permits states to torture suspected terrorists. Because if we take state practice seriously, that's exactly what's happening. And so I tried in the end of the book, I should say that this all started off as about a 10-page little short thing without citations for foreign affairs. And it grew, and it's unfortunately grew because the radically moderate approach does success that there's some room for nuance in our discussions. That's why you all have to buy the book, because it's much more nuanced than anything I can say up here. I can guarantee you that I'm not going to be retiring on the royalties. But I think that we do run a real risk of losing the perception, the psychological perception, that maybe is coming back with the climate crisis, that we all really are equal on this world. We're not equal in a practical sense, but at least in a metaphysical sense or an ethical sense. And that all governments, whatever their stripe, have obligations that they should meet. And then that it's primarily going to be regionally or domestically that we do the political work, the on-the-ground work, to get governments to translate these, what are often very broad principles, into things that will make a real difference in people's lives, both in terms of equality and non-discrimination, but also in terms of criminal justice and fair trials and development schemes that don't relocate 500,000 people without providing them for housing, little things like that. So there's both a normative, legal, and an ethical part of it. But I think it's really more the ethical part of it that I'm worried about than the legal part. 'Cause I know too well the limits of law. When Sarah identified a lot of them, I agree absolutely with her. That's why I don't want to force all the good things into human rights, because I do think that human rights as law are still an important step forward.
Jim Michael, I appreciate very much this debate, and it reminded me of something as I was listening to the exchange between Sarah and Professor Hammond. It's an anecdote. Around 1990, the World Bank, which has been for years, saying that we were wrong in saying we could use our voice and our vote in the World Bank on human rights grounds, because that was political. Two people in the World Bank developed an argument that you could trace all of the things that are important about governance and human rights and justice to the Universal Declaration. And that the Universal Declaration was accepted by all the members of the World Bank. And therefore, these were legitimate things that were, if they were relevant to development, the World Bank could do that. That persuaded that General Counsel with whom I used to argue, and he wrote an opinion that said governance is okay as far as the World Bank's development work. So you wind up from that to the World Bank now doing justice programs, now doing corruption programs, now doing things that relate the law to governance, to development. And you wind up with the SDGs and SDG 16 that endorses governance and law as part of the development agenda. And so you have here this linkage where having the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is about human rights, which is recognized as customary international law and has been endorsed by the United Nations and has a force of law to that extent, being an instrument that affects how we do development. And what's wrong with that? I don't see, is that stretching something? The fact that law and development and human rights go together, it seems to be a good thing. And that tactically, you don't always use the human rights argument to advance your goals, but having that connection in law and human rights and development, it seems to me it's great. So I don't understand the concern.
No, I think you're right. I mean, clearly there's a connection. And the bank has changed a lot since the 1990s. It deals with governance issues. It deals with corruption. It deals with indigenous rights. An essential part of everything it does is women's equality. It still doesn't say that it does human rights. And so we have a special rapporteur, Philip Alston, whom many of you I'm sure know, who railed against the bank because it doesn't recognize human rights. Now, I'm no bank defender and I don't know how much this works in practice, but the substance is what's important. Corruption is another criminal issue.
But the bank wouldn't be doing corruption if they hadn't been persuaded that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the basis for the bank's work and things like that.
Well, you may have better sources than I do. I think they decided to do something about corruption, but because it interfered with the possibility of good development given the money that they were giving away.
That's the difference between the legal ability to do it and Jim Wolfen's persuasiveness of whether they should do it.
Right. And unfortunately, Mr. Wolfenson isn't around anymore, and I don't think the bank has officially changed its tune, which is fine with me. I do think they took inspiration from the Universal Declaration and from honesty and from equality.
I'll give you the same.
Okay.
But actually, even at the bank, I mean, there has been, even in the past year, significant progress. They just adopted, a year ago, a new environmental and social framework,
Yeah.
which, and they still don't like to call it human rights, but essentially requires all bank employees to look at all bank projects for human rights compliance, which is gigantic for the bank.
Yeah. And if that works, it's good. I'm not saying that's a bad way to deal with it.
Okay, yeah.
I think possibly a slight response. My name is Lisa Avalio. I'm an attorney in Maryland, and I do public criminal defense. So I'm always in court. I see a lot of these cases. I think they touch on human rights, obviously, discrimination. we're very prone to punish, we like to punish, unfortunately. And I also do research on Middle Eastern affairs and politics, and this is a completely different perspective, again, with human rights violations all over the place. And I think there's a commonality between the two, domestic and international. And we disrespect human life, humanity in general, overseas, maybe under the guise of national security. That supersedes human rights, and it's prevalent. Locally, it's along the same lines. We disrespect humanity and human life. That value is not there for some reason. And let's say I'm an attorney, I believe in the legal structure, but it is a guide. If the value is not there, we're not going to follow the legal structure. It's as simple as that. It's how I see it in court and the results of many of my trials. So if we do want human rights, and I believe we need to instill that value, we respect humanity as something paramount. And if we don't succeed in that, in achieving that value, then we just need to move on. So my question is, well, I'm not going to be able to change the system unless I work on raising that value with the judges, with the prosecutors, and so on. So how do we get there? How do we actually make that the value across the board, the leaders in the Middle East, or locally, domestically, and so on?
It's a wonderful question. I think we all wish that humanity did outrank national security. I think in my view, at least, human rights is very conservative in that it accepts the system we have. It accepts the sovereign state system. I do too. I don't necessarily like it, but we've had it for 400 years, and I don't think in the lifetimes of anyone in this room that it's going to change significantly. So how do you change someone's views of humanity? How's it been working with Donald Trump? You change it, you can argue it in law, and we do have some phrases we can use about human dignity, although human dignity was probably used during the time of slavery, because we didn't consider everybody human. So it's politics again. It's social change. It's activism. You can use the slogans, but the slogans aren't going to do much for you. And frankly, the notion of a world government, I mean, even the EU is said to suffer from a democratic deficit. Imagine what a world government's going to be like. So what we need to do is get better leaders. I don't think we need to change the laws. I think most laws in the United States, not all, but most, could be applied in a fair and humane way if judges and political leaders and prosecutors had a different perspective. That's way beyond my pay grade. And I mean, we all know how to do it. We just know that it's extremely difficult to do. It starts off with educating people in a different way when they're in first grade. So I sympathize with your complaint, and I agree that that's a problem. But I don't think there's anything in this book or the Universal Declaration can help you very much with, because it's a down and dirty, grassroots, long-term project of social change. We've come a long ways. I think the world is a better place than it was 100 years ago. I think it's even going to be a better place 10 or 20 years from now than it is now. But I'm trying to agree with Sarah and define the role for law. And I think our real disagreement is you don't want to define human rights only as law, and I don't really know why that is.
Because I think if it's defined only as law, we will continue to see the opposite of broadening constituencies, a narrowing. But I think there's another point of disagreement.
I knew I'd find one.
Around the issue of sovereignty. I think that sovereignty is more elastic in the 21st century. And the Russians have been very good, the Kremlin has been very good at playing, on the one hand, a kind of hyper-sovereign card, labeling organizations as foreign or undesirable, and then, of course, occupying another country, and then interfering in other elections. So I think this issue of sovereignty is more freighted than perhaps you're suggesting.
Mark, I'm going to let you have the last word, and then I imagine our speakers will be able to hang around a little bit as we come to the end of our time. Mark?
Well, I think to the last question, and how do we get out of this conundrum, however we define it? I think we really do have to focus on the lack of global leadership right now. And when we have, there's a very good chapter in this book about U.S. leadership on human rights, and it's been inconsistent, and we are not the indispensable nation. But when the U.S. isn't at the table, when the U.S. is actively undermining human rights protections at the UN and elsewhere, it really does damage globally. When President Trump is cozying up to the worst human rights dictators in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and Philippines, and elsewhere, it really does damage. And it not only cozying up to them, but actually publicly defending them. I don't think we can overstate the harm this is doing to the human rights project.
Okay. Well, on that not very happy note,
Uplifting note.
let me thank you all for being here. Thank Hurst in particular for this really thought-provoking book and giving us the excuse to get together and chew on it. Let me encourage you all to keep your eye out for our next Rule of Law Index, which will be launched in March of 2020, and we'll see how the factor of 4 scores are doing then. And please join me in thanking our panelists.